Welcome to the podcast, Let's Talk Polarization. I'm your host, Olivia Chang, a Bay Area high school student passionate about addressing America's political divide. LTP examines political polarization through a multitude of lenses: vaccination, religion, economics, and more, to educate youth, stimulate civil discourse, and increase cross-partisan unity. Our bi-weekly episodes include interviews with experts and discussions between passionate individuals seeking common ground. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. James Adams, a professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Davis, whose research explores parties' election strategies along with the levels, causes, and consequences of cross-party hostility and distrust in Western publics. This is the first of two episodes with Dr. Adams. In the first, Dr. Adams explains why shifts in voter policy preferences, shifts in rival party policy, and past election results motivate party elites to shift their policy positions, and the uses of valence-based versus policy-based campaigning. The second episode investigates the implications of vote-seeking parties on competition and party governance, and how they may interact with California's open primaries, and posits a cautionary tale for a polarizing America through historical precedent and the psychology of group allegiance. Enjoy! Welcome, Dr. Adams, and thank you so much for being here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm James Adams, and I'm a professor at UC Davis. This is my 18th year now. Before then, I was a professor for 11 years at UC Santa Barbara. So I've been in the University of California system now for close to 30 years. And I'm not the first Adams to work for the University of California system. My father was a professor at UC Berkeley for over 30 years. And my grandfather was a professor at UCLA. My great grandfather was a professor at Stanford. So, in a way, it was almost foreordained that I would become a professor somewhere in California. In terms of how I got interested in this particular topic of affective polarization and anger and distrust and hostility across party lines, well, this really started, Olivia, I'd say 7 or 8 years ago, just looking at the state that our country was in and seeing the degree of anger and distrust and hostility that we see in the United States now, which has struck me at least as being truly extraordinary and much more intense than was the case, say, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So I was interested in a number of questions related to affective polarization. Well, how bad is it really in the United States? How does the level of distrust and political hostility in the United States compare to the levels in other countries like Britain or France or Germany and so on? Where does all this anger and hostility come from? And I was interested in that last question because I don't think we can fix the problem unless we understand where the problem is coming from and where all this anger and hostility comes from. So that's how I came to do research on this question, which has resulted in a book and several research articles. And these are all in collaboration with Noam Gidron, who is a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and Will Horn, who is currently a postdoctoral student at Georgia State University and recently got his PhD from Princeton University. We've been working on these questions now for 3 or 4 years to figure out what steps we can take to try to defuse the situation and get us back to a more normal political environment and one that doesn't pose all the dangers and risks that I see in America in 2022.
Yes, I completely agree with this view of American politics today. Where do you think this issue of political polarization originated? And when did it begin to have dangerous consequences for American politics?
Right. Well, Olivia, there's extensive research not conducted by me or my co-authors that documents the rise in affective polarization in the United States over the last 40 years or so. And what we see if we compare, say, America in 2022 with America in 1980, which is about as far back as some of these surveys that we have that we use to measure the degree of anger and hostility. That's about as far back as they go. What we see is that Americans today, those who think of themselves as Democrats and Republicans, they express about as much liking and warmth towards their own party now as was the case back in 1980, but they express far more hostility and contempt and distrust and dislike towards the opposing political party, both towards politicians from the other party, but also towards just the rank and file citizens who support the other political party as well. One thing I should mention, Olivia, is it's really only been in the last few years that many professors have begun to study affective polarization. Because of that, the field is really just starting out, and what we don't know is much more extensive than what we do know. We're getting towards where we feel we can measure the level or intensity of hostility and distrust fairly accurately. But the question about where it comes from, we're doing the best we can, but we're really at the stage of collecting information. Nevertheless, let me try to answer your question by talking about some of the research that Noam Gidron and Will Horn and I have done, not about economic issues such as what should the tax rate be or how much money should we spend on social welfare programs or social security or unemployment compensation, but debates over what we label cultural issues: abortion and gay marriage and immigration and Black Lives Matter and defund the police and affirmative action. What we've seen in the United States is that these types of issues have become a much bigger part of the political agenda. Politicians spend a lot more time talking about them, and the disagreements between the parties on these issues have grown much sharper. We have this paper called Who Dislikes Whom, which is appearing soon in a journal called the British Journal of Political Science. What we document in that is that in the US, but also across other Western democracies, these cultural issues are increasingly the factors that are making people contemptuous across party lines. And as to why these kinds of issues seem to make people angrier than economic issues, it was nicely put by another political scientist who said that while on economic issues we can compromise over who gets what, cultural issues are about who we are. And where you stand on gay marriage or abortion or Black Lives Matter, that may feel like it touches your gut. This is your core identity of who you are. And you may see the people on your side not simply as being right, whereas the people on the other side are wrong, but you may see the people on your side as being righteous and good and noble, and the people on the other side as being ignorant or delusional or perhaps even evil. And what Noam Gidron and Will Horn and I show in our book called American Affective Polarization in Comparative Perspective is that compared to all the other Western democracies, and we looked at 20 Western democracies, including all the big ones, Britain and France and Germany and Canada and so on, the United States is the one where there's been the sharpest rise in disagreements over these cultural issues over the last 25 years. That research suggests that one of the reasons why the amount of politically based anger and hostility in the United States has ratcheted up so dramatically over the last several decades has been the rise in these cultural issue debates, which seem to dominate the political agenda much more now in the United States than they did in previous generations.
That's really fascinating. Do you believe that America's shift towards these cultural issues is what's motivating party elites to shift their policy positions?
You've raised here an absolutely crucial question. So we can identify that cultural issues have become a bigger part of the agenda. But the question, of course, is why? And that I can speculate, but I want to note here that what I'm about to say in my answer, this is just based on my personal impressions, and it's not based on any systematic research. One reason, which is related to the fact that these issues seem to make people angrier, maybe politicians recognize that, and they can use this factor to mobilize their base. Politicians on both sides know that, well, if they talk about these kinds of issues, people on their sides of the issue who, to put it simply, will get fired up. And by getting fired up, they might be willing to not only vote for that candidate, but to work on that candidate's behalf during a campaign, to donate money, to post videos, and to spread the word. So, to put it simply, it might be that activating these cultural issues works in terms of winning votes and getting elected. Another possibility, and I need to stipulate again, this is not something I've studied. This is the way to get viewers if it's a cable news program, or to get listeners if it's talk radio. That if you talk about these things, you can get people really angry if you're talking about the other side's position, or you can get people feeling very self righteous and superior if you're talking about your own position. So it seems to me there that it could be that both politicians and, frankly, profit making news outlets recognize that talking about these kinds of issues works. Now, one last point I should mention is I'm talking about these issues now as if, oh, isn't it a shame that we're talking about these cultural issues? They're making us so angry. Note that another way to look at this is to say, well, no, we need to talk about these issues because there are changes we need to make. And if making changes makes people uncomfortable or resentful, so be it. Take the issue of gay marriage, for example, or Black Lives Matter. What people who support gay marriage or who support the Black Lives Matter movement might say is, yes, we recognize that these issues are controversial and they make people angry. Anything that is worth doing and involves progress always makes people angry. It was controversial when Lincoln freed the slaves. It was controversial when Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and another one in 1965. But thank goodness we did them anyway. That being said, it does appear that these issues do make people angry, and that a considerable portion of the anger and hostility that we're seeing across Western democracies, but in particular in the United States, is driven by those sorts of issues.
Is there a new way to approach these cultural issues without inciting anger or affective polarization? Or is it just something that is a byproduct of it and inevitable?
Olivia, that's a great question. And it's one that I think about a lot. While we're talking about anger and distrust in the United States, our research suggests that actually, compared to other Western democracies, the United States is not especially politically divided. I'll give you my own opinion about this, unsupported by systematic research, that one of the great drivers of this is the fact that both sides don't simply see themselves as being right and the other side is wrong, but see themselves as being good and the other side as being bad at least, and perhaps even evil, particularly in the cultural issues where people on both sides tend to make assumptions about people on the other side, even though they don't necessarily know the people on the other side and haven't worked hard to understand their point of view. If you watch cable news shows, you might get the impression that everyone who supports affirmative action or Black Lives Matter aren't simply wrong. They're ignorant and they're libtards who hate America. If you watch other cable talk shows, you might get the impression that anyone who opposes gay marriage or Black Lives Matter is a racist or homophobic or a misogynist. I find that quite upsetting, that both sides think that they're very tolerant. What I'd ask is this: how tolerant is a person if they harshly judge the people who disagree with them without knowing them and without making a real effort to understand their point of view? It seems to me that what people need to realize, and this is something I believe, and I could be wrong, is that it's better to treat the other side with respect. And my own view about this is that the only way, whatever side you're on, that you're likely to change the minds of people on the other side is if you approach them with respect. But a lot of people don't do that. And it's because they make the assumption that the other side is morally compromised.
I completely agree. And similarly, what do you believe motivates the ideological shifts of political parties as a whole?
All the research I did up until about 2015 was looking at exactly that question, trying to understand when political parties or candidates shift their policy positions. And to get at the other question, well, what works? Because presumably parties or candidates shift positions. Well, they'll tell you it's because we've changed our minds. It might be. One sometimes suspects they're doing it to try to get votes. And then the question is what actually helps you get votes and what doesn't? It can be surprisingly difficult to answer that question, first of all. It's one reason why I stopped doing research on it, to be honest. I'll just list for you some of the things that seem to motivate parties or candidates to shift their positions. One, which won't surprise you, is when public opinion shifts. Of course, not always. Sometimes parties or candidates hold their ground and they say, I'm not going to move to where the public is. I'm going to try to convince the public to move to where I am. Another factor which has been shown to influence parties, at least in the short run, is what happened in the last election. If a party did poorly in the last election, they're more likely to rethink their policy positions. Whereas a party that wins the election is more likely to reason, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. To give you one historical example of this from outside the United States, I teach a class on British politics. After World War II, the British Conservative Party, which is somewhat similar to our Republican Party in the United States, dramatically shifted its policy positions in favor of spending a lot more money on social welfare programs to promote public health and public housing, unemployment compensation and old age pensions and aid to dependent children. And it was stunning. Here was this party that traditionally was seen as conservative, the party of low taxes and low spending on social welfare, suddenly embracing policies that you would think, gee, these are the policies a socialist party would support. Well, if you ask, why did the conservative parties change their policies? The most plausible explanation is they lost the 1945 general election in a shocking defeat. They were expected to win, and they were expected to win big, in part because their leader was Winston Churchill, who was seen as this heroic war leader who had led Britain to victory in World War II. But they reasoned, gee, if we lost, even though Winston Churchill, the great war hero, is our leader, it must be that our policies are quite unpopular.
I recently read one of your publications that mentioned that a rival party's policy shifts may shape a party's policy adjustment. Do you think that that's a factor of political polarization? And how might that play out in the United States?
This is research that I did with Zeynep Somer-Topçu at the University of Texas at Austin. What we found in our research, and this was across more than a dozen democracies, was that there is evidence that if a political party sees the other parties changing their positions, then that party is likely to follow. What we've actually seen in the United States over the last 40 years is the Democrats shifting to the left on economic issues, but also on these cultural issues, and the Republicans shifting clearly to the right on economic issues, and also in some important ways on cultural issues. Not on all of them. So in the US, we have this odd phenomenon of the parties shifting in opposite directions. But it's hard to understand exactly why the parties have shifted their positions in this particular way.
It's such an interesting finding, a counterforce to political polarization that we don't see in American politics. Moving on to political party campaigns, is campaigning on issue-based appeals or valence-based appeals more effective for the politician?
Okay. Congratulations, Olivia. You've clearly done a lot of homework for this interview. So this is an article you're referencing that I wrote with Professor Amber Boydston, who's my colleague in the political science department here at UC Davis. And just to explain a couple of the terms that you just used there, note that one thing that parties can do when they're running a campaign is they can decide to talk about policy debates on which people disagree with each other, where you and I may have different positions about tax rates and social welfare policy or gay marriage or abortion or what have you. But parties don't have to talk about those kinds of things. They can also talk about things that political scientists label valence issues. And these have to do with things like how competent and honest the politicians in the party are, whether they have charisma, whether they provide strong leadership, whether they are caring, and whether they have empathy. These are called valence issues because these are issues where everyone agrees about what they want. But the difference is, of course, that some parties and some politicians are viewed as being stronger on those dimensions than others. Some politicians are viewed as more honest, some as less honest, more competent, less competent, and so on and so forth. Boydston and I have found that when parties talk about themselves, they mainly talk about these policy debates, their policy positions. But when they talk about their opponents, then they talk a lot more about their opponents' personal qualities. And of course, they're generally attacking their opponents rather than saying, we disagree with this politician on this particular issue position. It's possible this contributes to the degree of anger and hostility and distrust across party lines, because in some cases, what you're saying about your opponent, again, is my opponent is not simply wrong, they are a bad person. We've seen extreme examples of that in American presidential campaigns in recent cycles. If you take the 2016 campaign, in which former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was the Democratic nominee against Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, well, you had Donald Trump labeling Hillary Clinton as crooked Hillary. You can't have a much more personal attack than that. And Hillary Clinton famously said in one of the debates about Donald Trump, "You're not fit to be president." She wasn't talking about his policy positions. She was talking about what she saw as his personal behavior and personal characteristics. And she said this in the debate shortly after these famous Access Hollywood tapes came out, in which Donald Trump could be heard on tape talking an extremely crude way about women. And so both candidates, they discussed issues, but when they talked about each other, the message seemed to be, this person on the other side, they're not just wrong. They're bad, bad, bad people. And again, it's possible that these kinds of personal attacks against one's opponents are one of the things that fuel this anger across party lines.
Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Polarization. I hope you learned something new today, whether it be about valence-based campaigning, about British politics, or to have more tolerance for divergent viewpoints. Tune in 2 weeks for the second half of my interview with Dr. Adams. He details how our political systems drive politicians toward extreme positions and puts forth a cautionary tale for a polarizing America. See you then.